Well, as we get to the Word this morning, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is just how we get caught up, each one of us in our lives. It's easy to get caught up in fear. In fact, I would say that in this flesh, man has a tendency or a proclivity towards fear. Absent faith in Jesus Christ and the assurances of His Word, it's easy for us to all just kind of yield to one kind of fear or another. But we know from Paul's second letter to Timothy that God doesn't give us fear. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse number 7, familiar verse, says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." But when we focus our lives on just what we perceive in this natural world, instead of focusing our lives on the promises of Jesus and the promises of His Word, we find that we very quickly, and sometimes without even realizing it, slide right into a fear. Fear is the nature of this flesh. And that's made evident by the vast number of phobias, and there are hundreds and hundreds, Jeff, am I right? Hundreds and hundreds of phobias that have already been identified and given names to. Now, some of those phobias we're all familiar with. They're very common. There's phobias like, Tony's going to show you some of these. We're all familiar with claustrophobia. Claustrophobia is that fear of confined spaces. Don't like being in elevators, small rooms, tight conditions. There's also a very common fear, common phobia, which is called acrophobia. Acrophobia, you may not have heard that term before, but that's the fear of heights. A lot of people would probably be uncomfortable standing up even at this little elevation here. To lesser or greater degrees, some people have experienced fear of heights. There's also aerophobia. Again, you might not have heard of that, but a lot of people have a fear of flying. Some of these fears may not seem all that important, but like the fear of flying, can become crippling, debilitating in someone's life. And agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is that fear of open spaces and crowds. So people that suffer with agoraphobia, they tend to like to stay in their own houses. They have comfort in their own homes, and they don't want to leave their homes. So again, as I just mentioned some of these common ones, you probably know some people that have experienced this, or maybe to a lesser or greater degree, maybe you've felt some anxiety over some of those things yourselves. But the thing is, when we give ourselves over to fear of any kind, if we give ourselves over to fear, fear then controls our mind, our thoughts, and thus it controls our very lives. Fear is a snare. It is a trap of Satan that he has set to hold people captive, so they cannot become the man or woman of God that He designed them to be. Now, we know that from Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse number 25, it says, "The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe." If you have any kind of a phobia, or if you just have the tendency to easily fall into fear, don't be ashamed of that. I mean, I have sometimes the tendency, I can empathize. There are times that I have the tendency to give myself over to fears. There's been numerous times when Donna has had to physically, emotionally, or spiritually snap me out of wrong thinking and show me, let me see that I'm thinking wrong, I'm thinking incorrect. I'm giving myself over to fears. And I will tell you from personal experience that if you give yourself over to fear, very quickly that fear can become an obsession. It becomes all that you think on. So if you have some phobias or you easily give yourself over to fears, don't be ashamed, but realize that there is liberty in Jesus Christ. And we do not have to live our lives in the bondage of any kind of fear. So fear is a snare. And we spring that trap when we focus our attention on the circumstances instead of looking to Jesus and looking to His Word. And once we get caught in that snare, once we get caught in that trap of fear, our fears can become irrational, and they can become obsessive. And if you doubt that fears can become irrational and obsessive, then just consider some of these other irrational and almost absurd phobias that have become so common in our culture that we've actually given names to these things. There's that many people that have given themselves over to these kinds of fears and phobias. I'm going to show you just a couple. This first one, and you can tell me if I pronounce them wrong, Jeff. I'm going to have you pronounce one of them. Genuphobia. Genuphobia is the fear of knees. Does that sound irrational? Listen, these people cannot look at other people's knees, and a lot of them struggle even looking and seeing their own knees. That's irrational fear. When we give ourselves over to fear, those fears control our lives, and our thinking becomes irrational. The next one is synglobiaphobia. The fear of cotton balls or plastic foam. Can you imagine? But this is such a common fear that they've actually given a name to it. I can't pronounce this one. I know it's with birds. It's ornithophobia? Ornithophobia? Oh. Well, I got that one wrong. I missed that one. I missed that one altogether. Okay, well, I can't even imagine having a fear of kissing. I just skip right over that one. Ornithophobia. So this is the fear of birds. I actually worked with a person that actually did have, Ruth, you may know who I'm talking about, someone who actually did have, she's a dread. I know that, Alice, you know who I'm talking about too. Had a fear. We just played some terrible jokes on her. But it's a real fear. It's a real phobia. And you probably don't need people like me in your life if you have those fears. Now, this next one I don't really think is a fear. Don't show it yet. I don't think this next one, I think this is really just a good, honest respect for how boring and how overwhelming numbers can be. I'm not really sure it should be a fear, but there is something called arithmophobia, which is the fear of numbers. I just think it's good to have a healthy respect for numbers and keep them at bay whenever possible. Okay, don't show the next one just yet, Tony. I just think this next one shows us that people in the field of psychiatry either have a great sense of humor or they have a mean streak. Because this one is a fear of long words. So if you're a psychiatrist and you know you have somebody that has a fear of long words, can you imagine saying to them, oh, I've diagnosed you. This is what you have. Hippopotamostrasa. Can't even do it. 35 letters in that word to accent the fact that you do have a fear of long words. I can't even pronounce this next one. I've tried. I'm sure there's a way to pronounce it, but this next one is actually a benefit to those of us who do like peanut butter because there's more peanut butter for the rest of us. This is, can I pronounce that, Jeff? This is the fear of peanut butter. That's the layman's term for a jiffy phobia. And then also, if you just want to cover all the phobias, you can just have phobia. What, Mia? That's, again, a healthy respect. And I keep zucchini at a distance. There might be a zucchini phobia. So for Thanksgiving, I made Mia. She didn't want to eat pecan pie. I said, it's so good, you got to have pecan pie. So we made a deal that if she would try pecan pie, I would try zucchini bread. Worked out pretty good for me because she got a piece of pecan pie, but there was no zucchini bread in the house. But I did promise I will try some sometime in your presence. I will probably need some psychiatric help to be beside me when I do that. So fears are common, but fears, any kind of fear, great or small, fears work against our faith. Fears cause us to look, or they cause us to focus on self instead of looking at and focusing on the things of God. In fact, the very first time that we see in the Bible fear is in the book of Genesis, and it's in the story of Adam, with Adam and Eve. And it takes place right after Adam and Eve were so self-focused that they gave themselves over to sin. So this is where it reads in Genesis chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Then the Lord called to Adam, and he said to him, "Where are you?" So he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." So fear entered into the world only after the fall in the garden. But why was Adam afraid? Adam said that he was afraid. This is what Adam said. He said, "I was afraid because I was naked." Adam was looking at, shame is a big part of it. Adam was looking at self. Adam became He became fearful when he became self-aware and he became self-focused instead of focusing and looking at God. Fear comes when we take our eyes, we take our vision, when we look away from God and we look towards self. We look towards selfishness. We look towards the carnal and to the natural. Now, there's another key point in this verse that is often overlooked. God said to Adam, "Where are you?" So that means Adam was no longer where God was. Sin took Adam's eyes off of God and placed them on himself. Sin took Adam's eyes off of the Lord, and that is when Adam became afraid. It's when we look towards self, and we look towards the natural, we look towards the carnal, we look towards the flesh, and we take our eyes off of the things of God. And we take our eyes off of Jesus and off of his promises. We need to keep our focus. If you feel yourself in fear, it should tell you that you're looking in the wrong place. It should be a reminder to us to look towards Jesus Christ and to look towards all the promises that he has for us. Fear is looking away from God. It is looking at the carnal and the natural, and that always leaves us exposed. It leaves us spiritually naked. That's why we need to make sure that we give no place to fear. Fear is common, and people will tell you that fear is just a part of life. I say no, because it's contrary to the Word of God. Give no place to fear in your life. Do not accept it. Give no place to it. When I'm fearful, it says that I don't really trust that Jesus is going to deliver me, protect me, and bless me. In fact, we see a great picture of that with the disciples and Jesus when they were in the boat during the storm. Remember the story from Mark chapter 4. This is verses 37 through 38. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the pillow, speaking about Jesus. And they awoke him, and they said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Jesus brings peace. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" Again, fear works against our faith. And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" When I give myself over to fear, and I've been there, I've done that, when I give myself over to fear, Jesus asks me the exact same question that he asked those disciples. Jesus asked me, "Why are you so fearful?" Listen, I've personally heard that question being asked of me numerous times in my life, and I'm thankful for it. If you're ever just finding yourself stressed, filled with anxiety, filled with fear, and you hear that voice of God in your spirit saying, "Why are you so fearful?" Pay attention. I'm very thankful for it, because it brings to my attention that, whoa, wait a minute, I am looking at the wrong things. My thinking is wrong. Jesus asks me the exact same question. And when Jesus asks me that question, my response is always the same thing. When I hear him ask the question, and I know he's asking me, "Why are you afraid? Why are you filled with fear?" My response is always the same. Yeah, why am I so fearful? I have a whole life history with Jesus. And he has never failed me, and he has never not delivered me. And once I come to that realization, then just like Jesus, just as Jesus spoke to the storm and caused the storm to cease, I then speak to whatever it is that's causing me to fear, and I rebuke it. Jesus rebuked the storm. I rebuke whatever it is that's causing me fear. But I don't stop there, and I encourage you not to stop there either. I also rebuke fear itself. I actually say out loud, I give no place to that fear. And I tell you, without fail, when I say out loud, I give no place to fear, fear departs. Try it. If you're walking in fear and you feel anxiety and you feel uncertainty and you feel fear, Rebuke the fear, whatever the fear is that's causing you fear. And then rebuke fear itself. I remember the first time I ever learned that lesson. I was working at WJYM. This is 20-some years ago. I have no idea why, but I got out of the car. When you get out of the car at WJYM in the parking lot, there was a little step up onto a sidewalk, and the sidewalk went up across the building to get to the front door. I got out of my car, and before I even closed the door of my car, I could just feel this overwhelming sense of dread and fear. I had no idea why. But do you ever have that fear you get when you just feel like something bad is just waiting to happen? Something bad is about to befall you? You ever feel that way? You're all looking at me like you've never had this experience in your lives. I know I'm not alone. So I stepped out of the car, and I just had this overwhelming dread, knowing that something bad was about to happen. And as I took those steps on that short sidewalk, I remember thinking, I don't want to go through my day feeling like this. And so I said, I give no place to that fear. And immediately, all of that anxiety, all that stress, and all that fear was gone. And guess what? Nothing bad happened. There was nothing, I never gave it another thought, but nothing bad happened. Satan will put thoughts of dread into your mind to see if you will hold on to them and if you will grab them. If you will grab them, this is the trap that he springs for us. Give no place to fear. So probably some of you came in today, and there probably is something that you've been anxious about, or maybe even that you're fearful of today. Give no place to fear. Now, if we go back to that biblical account of the story of Jesus and the disciples in that boat during the storm, you notice there are actually two kinds of fear that are mentioned there. The first kind of fear is the fear that the disciples had when they were looking at the storm. So the problem was they had their eyes on the natural. They were looking at the natural. That fear, in fact, the Greek word for that fear in that verse, the Greek word for that fear is delos. Delos means cowardly. And it's derived from another Greek word, which means driven by fear. And that's what fear will do. If I give place to fear in my life, fear will drive me. It drives all of my decisions. Look back and think about the bad decisions you've made in your life. If you look back and you think about those bad decisions, you'll probably be surprised if you analyze it and realize how many times those bad decisions were made when you were being driven by fear. You've given yourselves over to fear. Fear always leads to bad decisions. Why? Well, when I'm fearful, I'm just like a steer in Satan's cattle drive. And cattle drives only go to one destination. And let me tell you, it's not a good ending point for the cattle. That's where they become a hamburger. You don't want to be driven by fear, but that's exactly what fear does. It drives us. So the second time that we see a reference to fear in those verses is after Jesus has already rebuked the storm and things are calm. It says, then the disciples were exceedingly fearful. Now, that word comes from the Greek word, which means to be passively alarmed. But what it really indicates is individuals who are awestruck. They were awestruck by Jesus. The word there, the Greek word there for fearful, it literally means to revere. It means reverence. If I'm only seeing the natural situation, the natural circumstances in my life, if that's all I'm seeing, I'm only seeing the natural, and I'm only seeing the carnal. That's going to leave me exposed. From personal experience, I'm telling you, the result of that is your thoughts become driven by fear, and that holds you captive. However, if my eyes are on Jesus, my eyes are on Jesus with a reverential fear, I can then speak to the storm in my life and calm the storm and walk in all of the deliverances that Jesus has already prepared for us. All the deliverances that he has personally already established and prepared for you. Give no place to fear. Now, the whole reason I even started looking at fear is because about a month ago, I decided to reread the book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah chapter 43, verse number 1, it gives us the instruction. It's a very simple instruction, very poignant. And this is what I want you to remember today. This is our attitude. Fear not. That's what it says. Fear not. It's a choice that we make. Isaiah chapter 43, verse number 1 says, "But now, thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, and who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine." Now notice that verse starts with the words, "But now." But now indicates there's a change of direction. But now means there's a shift from what had been. So what had been just before this? Well, in chapter 42 of Isaiah, God had just rebuked his people because they would not learn his lessons. They would not live for him. But now, God is changing the theme of the message. Now, the message is one of hope. Now, the message is one of faith. And the message comes with an instruction. The instruction is, fear not. In Isaiah's day, the redemption in Jesus Christ obviously had not yet come. But that has changed. That changed in the coming of Jesus Christ and the sacrifice of his blood and the new covenant in his blood. So now today when we read this verse, Isaiah chapter 43, verse number 1, when we read that verse, we should hear the voice of God speaking to us through the mist of the Old Covenant, of the Old Testament, speaking to us today who are the redeemed in Jesus Christ, speaking to us and reminding us that we are empowered to live lives that are free of fear as we choose to fear not. These are the lives that we are to live, free of fear. And I would even say that that spiritual attitude of fear not that we read in the Old Testament is spoken just as emphatically in the New Covenant. 11 times in the New Testament, 11 times Jesus said, commandingly, he used this phrase, "Do not be afraid." 4 times, angels use that exact same phrase when speaking to men. 2 times, angels use it speaking to Paul when Paul is in his seasons, his times of trial. Do not be afraid. Remember, God didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. I've told you guys this before. Fear is the opposite of a sound mind. So quite literally, fear is insanity. Fear is thinking insanely. But we have the power to live free of fear. So to do anything else is, well, insane. It's insane to not live in peace. It's insane to give ourselves over to fear. So what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of today? Is there sickness? Is there finances? Is there relationships? Is it you've looked at your past and you've seen where your parents are? Whatever it is. Are you fearful of your children? Are you fearful of society? Are you fearful of terrorist attacks? Whatever it is, what are you fearful of today? Choose not to fear. Choose to fear not. It's spiritually insane to focus on the problem instead of focusing on the promises. That is spiritual insanity to dwell on the problems instead of consciously saying to yourself, look away from the problem, put your eyes on Jesus Christ and on his promises. Anything else is spiritual insanity. Make the choice to fear not. So let's go back to Isaiah chapter 43. Verse number 1 again. I want to read that to you again. I want to point out a couple other words to you. But now, thus says the Lord, who created you, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I've redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine. Notice the words formed and created are in that verse. That takes our minds back to the creation account when God formed and created everything out of nothing. Let's go back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. At creation, God took what was formless and He gave it shape. He took chaos and He gave it order. When we give ourselves over to fear, when I give myself over to fear, when we give ourselves over to fear, we are going from sanity to insanity. We're going from order to chaos. And that will always spiritually blind us to spiritual truths and to spiritual realities. If I am thinking insanely spiritually, I'm blinding myself to spiritual realities that I need to focus on, think of, and be aware of, and stand on. If I am just looking at the natural circumstances, if I'm only looking at the natural circumstances and only looking at the situation, I'm not going to see the promises that Jesus has already established for me in the spiritual realm. Why? Because I'm looking at the natural. Remember, Isaiah said, "But now." We are living in the day of but now, because we are the redeemed in Jesus Christ. So look to Jesus. Put your focus on Jesus. Look to Him who has already created everything that you would ever need in your life. Choose to fear not. And watch as your answers, which are already prepared, already established for you in the spiritual realm. Choose to fear not, and watch as all of those things that are already prepared for you begin to form, take shape, and manifest here in this natural world. And so all the things of chaos are displaced. They yield and they are displaced by order and by the victory of Jesus Christ. Does that make sense? Don't give yourself over to fear. The world will tell you fear is just common and natural. Well, I would say it's natural to the flesh, yes, but it should not be common to the believer, to the redeemed in Jesus Christ, to those who are under the new covenant in Jesus' blood. Fear is not for you. And it will cause your thinking to go astray. It will cause you to think literally insane thoughts. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 43, verse number 1 again, but I want you to focus on the end of this verse. On the end of the verse, it says, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name." Love this verse. Think about how intimate your relationship with Jesus is to Him. Let me say that again. Think about how intimate your relationship with Jesus is to Him. He's redeemed you by His blood. He has claimed you as His own. And He is personally calling you by name. This is one of my favorite verses. This is favorite verse number 736. Because every time I read this verse, Isaiah chapter 43, verse number 1, what comes to my mind is just a story that I love. Because God really revealed the truth of that phrase to me. Probably 20 years ago, Mark and Jean's son, Craig, and I went down to Uruguay on a missions trip. And Isaac Smithia was the one who invited us. And he had a school, it was a Bible school that was there in Uruguay. And he asked me to come speak for a week at that school. And so I was there speaking, and I noticed the first day that I was there was probably about 20 students that were in the class. And I noticed that everybody was giving me full attention, but there was one young man who sat in the very back row, off on the right. He sat as far away as he could, and the whole time he sat there, this is what I saw. And he did not stop staring the whole time. And it was unsettling, because as I'm trying to speak, I'd like to make eye contact with people, But I basically couldn't look in that back corner because I saw that hard stare at me. And after the second day of this, Isaac is my friend, and I said, Isaac, what's with Juan? You know, what? He said, why? I said, well, this is the look I'm getting the whole time. He laughed, and he said, Juan's had a really tough background. I tell you, I know exactly what he's doing. He's very spiritually sensitive. He is checking you out because he's seen a lot of people who claim to be Christians that are not real. He is checking you out to see if you are real. So once I understood that, at least made it easier. And by Friday, by the end of the week, Juan was much more different face. But here's the beautiful part. It was on that last day, Friday. We'd always have lunch. We'd go to the cafeteria. We'd all eat together. And on Friday, I happened to sit towards the end of a table. Isaac was at the head. I was over here. Right across from me was Juan. Now, Juan doesn't speak English. The whole time I was there, I would teach, and Isaac would interpret. So Juan doesn't speak any English. So I was eating whatever they prepared, and across the table, Juan, who had started the week by giving me that cold, dark stare, all of a sudden I heard, meow. And I looked at him, and he pointed to his food, and he went, meow. And Isaac started laughing because he said, don't worry, it's not a cat. Juan's just messing with you. So I said something to Juan through Isaac. And then Juan got very serious, and he got very tender. And he told me his story. And Juan said that when he was a little boy, 5 years old, his mother had passed away. He'd been living with his father. He lived in, I forget the name of the capital of Uruguay. Yes, Montevideo. They lived in Montevideo. Montevideo is a very busy, as you would expect for a capital city. So when he was 5 years old, his father pulled up to a street corner in Montevideo, stopped the car, told his son in the passenger seat to open the door and get out. So Juan got out, his dad closed the door and drove off and left Juan standing there, 5 years old, in Montevideo. Now, Juan was picked up. Somehow the police got him. They found out he had two uncles that lived in Montevideo. So they took him to his two uncles. His two uncles gave him some nickname, which I don't even remember. But from that point forward, he was always called by that name. So from 5 years old, no one had ever spoken the name Juan at all. He was known by this other name. And his life with his uncles was not pleasant. They were very abusive to him. In fact, the highlight of that I always remember is he said his uncles had a doghouse out back. They tied him, they chained him to the doghouse like a dog, and they would bring out his food in a hubcap. And he would have to eat it out of a hubcap. They treated him like a dog, and that's the way he felt. He was abused. He had no love whatsoever. And when he was old enough to escape, he escaped from his two uncles. And he joined a gang. He eventually was cruel enough and hard enough that he rose to the top level of whatever this gang was. And he said when he was a young teenager, anytime that something bad happened in Montevideo, the Montevideo police went and got Juan first because they assumed that Juan probably had something to do with it, or at least he would know who was involved in it. So he was always in trouble with the police. And Juan said that he became, at one point, he remembered sitting in whatever hovel he was with, it was his gang. He remembered being so tired. Now, he was only probably 23 or 24 when I met him. And this is, obviously, he had gotten saved since then. But he said at that young age, he was so tired of just the pain of life that he said, I will never feel pain again. I will not receive pain. Pain will not touch me again. And to prove it to himself, he stuck a fire poker into the fire, got it red hot, and he showed me. He had burned some kind of a symbol using that hot poker on his arm. And he said, Todd, I didn't feel any pain at all. As it burned my body, I didn't feel any pain at all. And I knew at that moment I would never feel pain again. So he went on with this hard, rugged life. And he said one of his friends, for some reason, took him to a church. He didn't want to go to the church. I forget the reason that he went. But he was sitting there just biding his time as far back in the church as he could, mixed in amongst the crowds. And when the message was over, nothing had really touched him at all. But as everybody got up, all of a sudden, he heard a voice that called and said, Juan. And he was stunned because nobody knew his name was Juan. And he waited for a moment, and he sheepishly answered and said, what? And again, he heard the voice of God calling him by name and telling him that he loved him. That is God calling us by name, and that changed Juan's life. Juan got saved. Juan was in this Bible school so he could go into ministry after that. God knows us by name, and he calls us by name. So when I read this verse, Isaiah 43, verse number 1, I love it that it says at the end, fear not, I've redeemed you. I've called you by your name. You are mine. Jesus has personally, and does every day, personally call you by name. Personally. He personally leads you into your day. The Good Shepherd leads us into the day. The Good Shepherd knows your name, calls you by name, and as he calls you by name, he leads you into the day. He's calling you by name. Listen to his voice. Listen to him speaking to you. And then just follow. If I just follow Jesus as he's calling me by name, what would I have to possibly fear? Luann read part of these verses when she was speaking this morning. John chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. Jesus is the Good Shepherd. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, and they know his voice. I want you to think about what that's saying, because we are told that Jesus calls us by name. We're told that he leads us into the day, and we're told that he goes before us into the day. That means that Jesus has already seen everything that you're going to face in the day. And because he's already seen everything you could possibly face in the day, he's already made all the preparations. He's made all the deliverances that you require and that you need for the day. That is Jesus calling us by name. So if that is true, what do I have to fear? Absolutely nothing. Give no place to fear. The world will tell you fear is natural. It's part of the human condition. Again, I say fear is the nature of the flesh. But it's not the nature of the born-again believer in Jesus Christ. We have the nature of Jesus, and he said, fear not. He said, do not be afraid. Now, next week, I'm going to look at two more verses. I'm going to look at verses 2 and 3 out of this, as we continue to learn to fear not, making the choice to fear not. But I want to close with this one quote, which I love. This is from Rudyard Kipling. Of all the liars in the world, sometimes the worst are our own fears. Of all the liars in the world, sometimes the worst are our own fears. That is so poignant, because Satan is the father of lies. And so every fear he presents to you is a lie intended to trap you. It's a lie intended to ensnare you and keep you from being all that you can be in Jesus Christ. Give no place to fear.